Perry, and I'm very pleased you're joining us right now. And we are on live with Facebook, and we will also, either now or perhaps a little bit later, we will also be on YouTube. And if you're just joining us right now, I'm very pleased that you can do so. And I'd like to welcome you to Friday. I had a professor when I was in the university working on becoming Dr. Perry. He was so funny, and I just really liked him a lot. His name was Dr. Bobby Hopkins, and he was from Texas. And he wasn't Robert Hopkins. No, he was Dr. Bobby Hopkins. Just brilliant guy. And he used to say to me when we all went into the class every Wednesday night or Thursday night or whatever it was, he would walk in, he would say, "Welcome to Friday. And now I have a quite wonderful and exciting opportunity to hear from you on this exam." And he used to talk that way all the time. And over a period of a year, where I kept going to these classes, learning how to do his particular specialty, I used to mimic him too. And he would look at me and he'd say, "Now, Perry, cut that out." So welcome to Friday. I hope you're well, and I hope you are, one, wearing masks, and two, you are doing social distancing, three, you're washing your hands, and you are being responsible. You are somehow following the direction of most of the people in medicine and in science, encouraging you to protect yourself and protect other people. Remember, when you're wearing a mask, you're, in addition to protecting yourself, more important, you're protecting other people. So I do encourage you very strongly to avoid the thought that you're bulletproof and it's very unlikely you'll ever get infected. If you look at the stats over the last few weeks, you'll notice that the degree to which people are getting just huge amount of infections is just alarming. And now we have a variety of hospitals that have very few beds, if any, available, because most of us tend to somehow think that we're bulletproof, that somehow or another it's going to be fine and we're unlikely to get COVID-19. So I do encourage you to follow the recommendation of the professionals out there. Wear your mask and do social distancing and practice common sense. And remember, common sense is very uncommon. Today, this is axiom number 4 of my Axioms of Life. There are some basic truths that I've learned after all these decades of working in this profession that really do affect most everybody throughout their lifetime. And these truths seem to be so self-evident, as you can imagine, most people are probably relatively too very unaware of exactly what they are. And I've written them down over a long period of time, and it appears as if these are basic truths that really require that you think about them and operate accordingly. And if you are willing to do so, your life is going to be by far better on many levels. And if you fail to do so, your life is going to be generally worse, less satisfying for all kinds of reasons. And these axioms of life I've already presented to you in previous recordings. You can find them on YouTube or you can find them on Facebook. I've already recorded a few of the 8. Number 1 is called "Life is as it is instead of how it should be." And as you well know, life is generally the way it is as opposed to how it should be. So you may want to walk through that material. Number 2 is called "Life is fair, life is unfair," and it's both. Because remember, when you're little, you would say, "That's not fair." And the answer is, that's right. That is unfair. So life is fair, life is unfair, and it's both. And number 3 is called "What you radiate, you attract. What you focus on expands. And people will treat you how you teach them to treat you." So I do encourage you to go to YouTube, look those up, take a look at them, send them to your friends. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, because the more you subscribe, the more we get a wider reach of everything we're doing to affect humankind. And as you know, this whole COVID-19 problem is a global problem. And some of us as countries are working better than others. Some of us are coping better than others. Some of us are operating from common sense better than others. And so therefore, I do encourage you to look at this material and hand it to your friends or your family for them to look at it as well. So here we go, ladies and gentlemen, axiom number 4. And number 4 is called, as an adult, you are responsible. Now, in the material I want to present to you today, I do want you to know that it's entirely likely that some of this stuff is going to get your attention. Some of this stuff will remind you what you already know. Now you may want to know it again. You also may notice that some of this stuff is going to bother you because it might confirm what you're already doing to some degree that perhaps is counterproductive. So after many decades, I've had the honor and the pleasure of globally working in the business of psychology, profession, including psychotherapy, consulting, speaking, writing, radio, television, facilitating improvements in all things relationship effectiveness, performance excellence, character development, and common sense. And as you well know, common sense is very uncommon. Been working with everything from marriages, family members, executives in big business, members of the community groups, citizens of many countries and cultures all over the world. And what is rather curious is, without surprise, the organizations of people that improved their behavior and relationships and performance effectiveness clearly and dramatically improved their financial results. Improved revenue, decreased cost of doing business, by far better quality of life when they acted in a responsible fashion as it relates to, for example, managing money. What's curious about this is that perhaps the biggest and most powerful dimension that I've learned as a clinician in countless personal and professional circumstances with my market is that the development and effectiveness to become fully functional actually does require that you become recognizing and practicing in the whole notion of taking responsibility for yourself and for your conduct. Let me do it again. What's really curious is that in all the work I've done over the last many decades, all over the world, regardless of culture, regardless of the company, regardless of the brand, regardless of the community, what I notice is that one of the biggest and most powerful dimensions that's important that that you, that your family, that your people in your community do to improve the quality of your life and your family's life is to continue to own and take responsibility for yourself and for your behavior and your contributions. What's curious is why that seems to be so obvious and so important. There's a reasonably to very large population of people, as they become adults, apparently refuse to do so. Somehow or another, they refuse to take responsibility for themselves, and they somehow either expect everybody else to do it for them, or they blame everybody else if they're failing to do it for them. Now, clearly, if you have children, and you were a child at one time or another, young and adolescent children are frankly unable to master this whole notion of taking responsibility for yourself, for obvious reasons. I mean, obviously, when you're really young, your parents have to take responsibility for you because you're ill-equipped to do so. As you become an adolescent, a teenager, then it's probably very likely that I would hope that your parents would gradually and incrementally give you more responsibility to take care of. The idea is, as you are a teenager and as you get a little closer to what could be called 21, the adult age, you will get more and more comfortable or less and less uncomfortable with the idea of being responsible for things. And what's curious, as you might imagine, is children and certainly adolescents routinely reject the idea that their behavior and contributions in relationships have any responsibility at all. And therefore, as you know, it's very difficult for teenagers to actually adopt becoming an adult. What's curious and paradoxical is most teenagers would rather somehow or another be insisting upon being treated like adults where they absolutely want to avoid acting like one. And there are people who are my age or older that are still behaving as if they're children, which is sort of curious. So let's suppose you were going to operate as an adult. Let's suppose you really were a highly, fully functioning adult. Let's suppose you've got your ducks lined up in a row, you're squared away, you're well adjusted, you capitalize on your strengths, and you recover quickly from your setbacks. Let's suppose you're fully functioning. If you are, then consider the following. Then you are absolutely willing to practice and take responsibility for any or all of the following. You take responsibility for yourself, your judgments, your actions, your decisions, your commitments, your initiatives, your relationships, your feelings, your beliefs, your behaviors, your standards of character, your successes, and your failures. Think about that. If you really are highly functional, you are perfectly okay with and willing to continue to practice and take responsibility for yourself, your judgments, actions, decisions, commitments, and on and on and on. I rarely run into people who are willing to do that. Some people are willing to do some of it. Other people are unwilling to either consider it or think it's part of their responsibility at all. What's curious is how big the population is of people who continue to avoid responsibility for themselves. And when they avoid, they always say, it's not my fault. It's your fault. The reason what the problem is you. If only you would change, everything would be fine. So often people would much prefer to avoid responsibility for themselves, somehow decide to make it somebody else's responsibility as opposed to your own. So what ends up happening is too many in our country practice the habit of avoiding responsibility for their lot in life, followed by adopting the victim mentality, where they continually describe the delicious agony of life while blaming everyone else but themselves for their life situation. You know what the problem is? The problem is you. The problem is them. They are doing it to me. And that's very popular, as you well know, in this country, and certainly perhaps in other countries as well, the whole notion of the victim mentality. A colossal expense to society, costing all the responsible citizens a huge price of ongoing taxes while the whole process of a bunch of victims suck the energy out of society. So therefore, remember, the biggest indication of being a fully functioning adult means that you're willing to take responsibility for yourself, both good and bad. It means you're willing to own it, whatever it is, rather than defend yourself and blame somebody else all the time and say, hey, it's not my problem, it's theirs, that's what they're doing to us. And that's very loud and very powerful and very chronic these days. There are certain groups of people who are blaming them, the organization, their gender, that other gender, or that other race of people, or whatever it is. Invariably, it's curious how often we somehow think it's somebody else's fault. And so we spend more time and energy defending ourselves than perhaps taking a look at how are we contributing to the problem in the first place. So here I'd like to ask you some foundational questions. And this, for some of you, you're going to agree. You're going to say, that's absolutely correct, Dr. Perry. And then for some of you, this is going to bother you big time. And I've been saying this to countless thousands of people all over the world for years. And it's curious how some people get really quiet when I say these things. So I want you to think about this that I'm going to ask you, 3 different questions. Then I'd like you to think about it again, because this is foundational to your fundamental growth and development. As it relates to taking responsibility for yourself and becoming a fully functioning grown-up, contributing to society so that you really feel like you've lived your life as opposed to you're waiting for it to be over. So let's go to question number 1, which is designed to help you determine which of these 3 questions is more a reflection of you. I've learned these lessons. I've learned them over a lifetime. I've learned these lessons sometimes the hard way. I've learned these lessons to the point where now a whole bunch of this stuff is standard operating procedure for me. And my experience is there's a direct relationship between the one that takes full responsibility and quality of life. So here we go. Number one, if your life now, as you take inventory of your life, if your life is largely going great, if your life is going well for you, you probably have had a huge contribution in creating the outcome of great. Let me do that again. If life is going great, you probably did that. You did the lion's share of that. You've contributed profoundly to those outcomes. Good habits, good health, good wealth, good positive relationships, strong character standards, legitimate happiness. You actually feel happy. You found your smile and you like it. You've had ongoing success, certainly some failures. You contribute to society for something more meaningful and bigger than you. There's a real high level of self-respect, and you're pretty comfortable inside your own skin. Usually, you can tell if you encounter somebody like that. If they have a lot of self-respect, a lot of horsepower, a lot of integrity, a lot of character, they contribute to society, their ducks are pretty well lined up in a row, they found their smile, and they're keeping it. Usually, that's pretty advertised quickly for most people. Most people who have found their smile, you can just look at their face, and it looks like they've got a pretty big smile, and they're really enjoying it profoundly. There's a whole bunch of other people that lost their smile a long time ago, and they have yet to find it again. When you are living a life that is really terrific as far as you're concerned, there's more life in your years than there are years in your life. You ever ask anybody how old they are? They will be reluctant to tell you. If you go to somebody and say, how's life going? Or how's your job going? Or how's your marriage going? If you ever had anybody, you ask them any kind of a question like that, the people whose life is going great, they'll say, my marriage, it's great. I'm having a blast. Or my job, I'm loving it. It's going really well. Or I'm so pleased that there's so much meaning and quality to the nature of my work, whatever that is. On the other hand, you'll notice that if you ask somebody, how's your marriage? They'll tell you, instead of how's it going, they'll tell you how long it's been. They spend more time counting moments than actually enjoying or paying attention to moments. You ever ask anybody this, how's your marriage? And they'll say, well, I've been married for 37 years, which of course suggests that they'd rather tell you how long they've been doing it rather than how much they're doing it. They could say, I'm having a blast. We've been married for 37 years. They could say that. There's a guy I know, he just loves his wife and he loves being married to her. So he's always talking about how terrific she is and how fortunate he is. He's found his smile. It's a good fit. Run into a bunch of other people, their face falls, depending upon what they're talking about. So, one, the question is your life going great? If so, then you did that. Let me do it again. If your life is going great, then you largely have taken responsibility for that. And therefore, you have a lot about your life that is a direct relationship to your contribution, the way you conduct yourself, the way you own your own behavior and your progress. So let's go to question number 2. If your life stinks, now there's lots of people who make a lifetime career of having a horrible life. If life is terrible for you, you probably also did that. You contributed to somehow or another your life being quite terrible. Bad habits, poor health, financially upside down, deceitful, you're undereducated, you're miserable, you're weak, you're irresponsible, you're dishonest, you're dependent, and you're useless. Chronically unable to keep a job. Lots of people who are chronically unemployed have trouble with the concept of showing up. What's curious is that if your life stinks, and you know people, it's either you or you know people in your network where their life stinks. They're complaining about it all the time. They're miserable, whatever it is. Or they just somehow think, well, I've hit a bad patch, or I'm down on my luck. If you run into people like that, you'll notice their conduct, they're both the way they look at it and the way they practice their life, certainly contributes profoundly to those outcomes. And what are the outcomes? Well, for some, the outcome can be either any of these or many of these. Homelessness, or you've gone to prison, maybe more than once, or substance abuse, or other forms of addiction, or you're financially broke all the time. To give you an idea about that, there's an enormous percentage of baby boomers, of which I am one, who either are unable to come up with $1,000 to take care of an emergency by the end of the month, or I think the stats were 80% of baby boomers have less than $20,000 in the bank, which would, of course, suggest they've lived their lives in such a way financial management has been completely off the table. Or there's a lot of people who are perpetually victims. Or they come from a very broken family, many of which have zero father involvement. Or you're on welfare. Or you're unemployed chronically. Or you're self-destructive. You'll notice that some people just have horrible lives. And rarely do they actually think about, all right, how am I contributing to these outcomes that seem to be so chronic? What's interesting about that, rarely do people actually think about their own contribution to the poor quality or the great quality of their lives. A lot of people would like to believe in luck as opposed to chronic practice makes either bad outcomes, if you're practicing counterproductive, irresponsible behaviors, or great practice makes really good outcomes. And it just has to do with to what extent are you willing to take responsibility for the habits that are really quite good and increase the projection that the outcome will be quite terrific. So one, if life is going great for you, you did that. Congratulations, good for you, and my guess is you're going to keep doing that. If life stinks for you, you did that too. Now, you can blame anybody or any organization or bad luck, or you can blame anything you want to do to blame it on anybody else or anything else. On the other hand, if life stinks, you did that. Now, there are people who learned the lessons the hard way, and they pulled themselves together. A couple of people that come to mind are Tim Allen. Tim Allen was, as you may know, he's a superstar, and he had Home Improvement as a television show, and he's a comedian. He's hysterically funny, and he's been in lots of movies. The guy's been enormously successful. You may be aware, may be unaware, that what really got his attention was many years ago, he was in prison for drugs. And he decided, in the middle of prison for drugs, in addition to being profoundly embarrassed, he decided, what a bunch of stupid, irresponsible choices I made, and now here I am in prison. So he decided to pull himself together, and he did. There's a variety of people who have done just that, who have pulled themselves together because they thought, what a dumb bunch of choices I made, profoundly irresponsible, and I want to pull myself together. Another one would be Wahlberg, Mark Wahlberg. He went to prison as a teenager. And he decided this is really stinks, and now he's a movie star, and he's doing really well, and he's highly admired by a lot of people. He's on the front of magazine covers all the time, and he's really impressive. So there are lots of people who decide, I really dropped the ball on failing to take responsibility, and look at the price that I have to pay for this, and they pull themselves together. There's another population of people who just keep on avoiding being responsible, and they have chronic problems for the rest of their lives. So number one, is it great? You did that. If it stinks, you did that. Number three is your life bland, vanilla, beige, underwhelming, meaningless? There's a huge population of people there. If your life is a huge pile of boring or beige or underwhelming or meaningless and unimpressive, if you're the kind of person that always sat in the middle of the classroom, in elementary school or middle school or junior high, if you always sat in the middle of the classroom, you may remember that a whole bunch in the middle of the classroom were afraid of getting called on. The ones at the front of the classroom generally were doing the job and working well and getting attention by doing well. More than half of them in elementary school were girls. Girls sat in the front more than boys. And they generally stepped up and did the job and did it well and got good grades. Boys, on the other hand, often sat in the back. And the ones that sat in the back still wanted attention, just like the girls. It's just that they got attention by being either the class clown or disruptive or something. But the girls wanted attention by being good. The boys wanted attention by being bad, which is why girls in elementary school very often called boys icky. They're just so icky. Well, girls mature faster than boys. And having said that, there was a whole bunch of kids that sat in the middle of the class. The ones who sat in the middle of the class wanted attention, but they were afraid of what would happen if they got the attention. So they sat in the middle, slumping down in their desk and trying to be under the radar, playing safe, afraid of what would happen if they got attention. So they always wanted to play safe. Problem with that kind of behavior is when you're playing safe all the time, you very likely contribute to a life that is boring, beige, underwhelming, meaningless, unimpressive, because you're playing safe all the time. So how does that manifest itself over a lifetime? Well, if life is sort of boring, unimpressive, and clearly there's a colossal difference between the way life was supposed to be in your head and the way it turned out, then you did that too. You simply put in time. You were doing just enough to get by. You kept waiting for hump day, or you kept waiting for payday, or you kept waiting for retirement, or waiting for life to be over. You can see a lot of people who do that, who just sort of pass their life with time rather than passing their time with life. Let me do it again. If life is a whole bunch of beige, unimpressive, underwhelming, waiting for it to be over, putting in just enough time to get by, and clearly you're unimpressed with what's happened with your life, and you're still sitting essentially in the middle of the class trying to play safe, then you're probably spending years passing your life with time, counting moments, rather than passing your time with life, which is actually enjoying and exercising and practicing moments. Think about that. Are you counting moments more, or are you actually living those moments? Now, there's a reasonably large population of people that you know or that are in your network who can actually avoid being responsible by refusing to do anything. Think about that. You can avoid being responsible by refusing to do anything. You just do enough about what you're told, and therefore you've said, well, doing nothing. You ever heard of people say to you, well, now listen, if you want to get something done and you want some help, you better go to a busy person. You ever heard that? If you want to get something done and you need some help, go ask a busy person. And the reason you want to ask a busy person is a busy person gets things done. So they figure out a way to make time to do it. If you go to a person who's a do-nothing person, a person that just sits back and does enough just to get by, you ever notice a person who's a do-nothing person invariably has trouble getting it done? Why? Because they generally would opt to do nothing and avoid responsibility. Finance, or cleaning up their house, or improving their education and improving their income, whatever it is, they're just waiting to be taken care of and then feel bad because they have been sitting on their backside. So if you think about this, is life going great? You did that. And if life stinks, you did that too. And if life is a whole new level of beige, boring, and underwhelming, you probably did that too. What's curious is that most people who have a life that's going really well, routinely their default is to take responsibility. I'll take care of it. I'll clean it up. I'll somehow produce that. I'll reduce my expense here. I'm going to save money over there. I'm going to keep exercising regularly. I'm going to eat right. I'm going to show love, care, regard to the people I love. I'm going to do the maintenance on the departments of my life. That's okay, meaning I'm simply going to do that. That's part of the price of admission to being an adult. If, on the other hand, life stinks, and the evidence of life being stink is that you're having trouble financially, your relationships are poor, you're in prison, or you're addicted, or you're whining about a circumstance all the time that's bad, and then you chalk it up to bad luck. Well, something about bad luck. I'm always struck. There's a population of people in my whole lifetime who have said, Dr. Perry, you're so lucky. And my thoughts are, really, really funny. The harder I work, the more responsibility I take, somehow, conveniently, coincidentally, the luckier I become. So to pass responsibility on to luck, I mean, there are occasions when some people are in the right place at the right time. That does happen. And that could be called luck. It's just that more than half the time, if there's a chronic outcome, you may want to consider what is the chronic outcome. If it's a good outcome, you probably did that. And if that outcome stinks, you did that too. So what happens to most of us in society when society is profoundly irresponsible? If you take a look at what's going on right now in society, you may notice that a whole bunch of people are cranky. And a whole bunch of people are divided, and a whole bunch of people are criticizing each other. And some people are behaving grossly irresponsibly and feeling entitled to do so. And some people are somehow so interested in blaming other people that we want to hold them accountable rather than looking in the mirror and holding ourselves accountable. So when most of us behave in a profoundly irresponsible fashion, what happens? What are the outcomes that indicate that the country, the society, the fabric of society is working poorly? Well, these are the kinds of things that happen when people avoid responsibility for themselves or their community or their family or whatever it is. And this has been going on for centuries. People go to war. People get divorced, often nasty divorce. People riot. That's been going on, let me check, again this year. People file lawsuits. It's always somebody else's fault. People come into uprisings, which is happening now. People start destroying things or burning things or stealing things. People commit crimes, more murders, more child abuse. People start lying and cheating a lot. Major recessions and depressions economically. People start cheating. People betray each other. There's lots of spousal abuse or domestic disturbance, or arson, let's burn something down, or organized crime. In extreme circumstances throughout the world, you know, if you know anything about world history, you know about genocide, or you'll know about cult behavior, or Ponzi schemes, or stealing and other horrible things people do to each other. Well, if you just look at all those, they sound pretty horrible. They sound pretty bad, and they have happened to us, or they've been happening now, or they've certainly happened over history with us as a species. What's interesting is that more than half the time when those kinds of things happen, those kinds of people are avoiding responsibility for themselves. They're making it worse, or they're blaming somebody else, or they're somehow or another wanting to spend all their time describing the problem rather than solving it. What's interesting about that is if you want to fix any relationship or any outcome at all, let's talk about common sense. If you want to fix any relationship or relationships, or you want to fix society, or you want to fix the organization of your company, or you want to improve the quality and culture of the way your community is working, you got to think about the obvious, and this is so obvious. Let's start with a marriage. Let's suppose you want to fix a marriage. Please understand, I've worked with countless marriages over many years, and many of them have improved substantially. What's absolutely requisite is if you want to fix your marriage and you want to get some professional help, then you and your spouse have to go to the therapist together, because the treatment or the patient is in fact the marriage. Which means if you have a marriage where one person is willing to step up and take responsibility and the other person in the marriage is unwilling to do anything, then the marriage is doomed. It's over. And the reason why it's doomed is that both people in the marriage contribute to the outcomes, both good and bad. If one person in the marriage is always blaming the other person and unwilling to step up and do anything different, I've seen this countless times in men and women. If one person is unwilling to take responsibility for contributing differently, and the other person is willing to do what's necessary to improve things, the marriage will end. And the reason it will end is because the patient, if you want to improve it, is both people in the marriage. That seems like it's obvious. And yet it's amazing how I've encountered in countless circumstances where one person refuses to do anything different. And the marriage dies right on schedule. Let's do the same thing with government. If government would much prefer to avoid responsibility for itself and blame somebody else all the time, which is clearly going on in our federal government, you'll notice there's two major parties, and you'll think of the two major parties, more than half the time they're pulling their finger out and blaming the other person or the other group. At which point, therefore, what gets done besides, let me check, nothing. Well, people in government who would much prefer to pull out their finger and point it at somebody else rather than take responsibility on how we can work together and reach agreement invariably are behaving like the spouses in a marriage. That one is willing to do it or not willing, or both is unwilling, but the only way you're going to fix it is you have to get together, watch this, and contribute differently. Learn new ways to contribute, new initiatives, much more productive initiatives in the marriage. And if you're unwilling to do that, and you are continually rewarded by being paid for an absence of any outcome, then you have a huge cash expense, which makes people very frustrated, which is exactly what's going on in this country. So it's impossible to improve any series of relationships, with personal or professional, when one person or group wants to improve and the other group wants to sit back and judge the group that they are blaming. So if you think about the nature of how certain groups of people out now in the country, certain groups, certain cultures, certain genders, if you just take a look at who's doing most of the belly aching, you'll notice that when people are belly aching and criticizing and pulling out their finger and blaming everybody else, what ends up happening is all that does is make people highly defensive. Because clearly, if you spend all the time and energy blaming and finger pointing, whoever they are, then you're what? You're avoiding responsibility for your own behavior and deciding it's their fault as opposed to looking in the mirror. And that could be very adolescent. That could be very childish. It's always their fault. Adults, if you want to be a fully functioning adult, means by definition you are willing to take responsibility for yourself and contribute differently. So let's suppose you were going to improve the quality of how you are going to take more responsibility for yourself. Clearly, on those occasions when I was much younger and I avoided responsibility, my life got worse. Spending a lifetime taking responsibility and cleaning it up and contributing differently and reaching agreement with people with whom I disagree, I just noticed that the more I take responsibility for myself and my contribution and the way I take initiative and my conduct, the more I do that, the better the outcomes are on a consistent basis. So, my recommendation is continue to do the following or start doing the following. Decide to operate from high standards. Decide to operate with self-respect guiding your decisions. Think about that. You're going to make a decision, and you look at the nature of the decision, of the initiative you're going to do, and you look at your own self-respect, and you say, okay, if I pull the trigger and do that, whatever that is, if my self-respect goes down because I decided to do that, is that a good decision? And the answer is no. One of the nice things about determining the quality of your decisions, if you decide, well, the only way you're going to get out of the situation is to lie, Well, I know people who chronically lie, and because they lie all the time, they have a whole bunch of people who may like them, but they really fail to trust them because they lie all the time. If you lie all the time, then that is highly irresponsible. So therefore, think about, all right, I want to make a decision to increase my ability to function. And if I make that decision to take that initiative, which might be difficult or scary or uncomfortable, or I might be showing off my soft underbelly and I might look human, then you got to say to yourself, okay, does my self-respect go up or down? If my self-respect goes up, that's a good decision. The more you take responsibility, the more your self-respect goes up. The more you take responsibility, the more your self-respect goes up. Can you imagine if everybody in the world were to routinely take responsibility for their lives, for their circumstances, for their health, for their finances, for their community? If virtually everybody did that as a default, we'd have an entirely different world, and we would certainly have a much better series of outcomes. So, take a look at this. Look in the mirror. And if you like and respect what you see, then good for you. Well done. Look in the mirror. If you're pretty proud and your self-respect is pretty terrific, then good for you. Well done. I'm very happy for you. And if other people have trouble with the fact that you're happy with what you see in the mirror, that's their problem as opposed to yours. On the other hand, if you're unhappy with what you see in the mirror, if you've turned into somebody that you dislike, that's a good way to determine the quality of a marriage. If you get around your partner and you turn into somebody you dislike, then clearly your contribution to that relationship is quite poor. And the biggest, fastest way in which you can just make that conclusion is when you get around your partner, do you like who you are? Or when you get around your partner, do you dislike who you turn into? Do you dislike who you are? Fascinating. It's all about you and your responsibility or lack of it, and your initiative or lack of it, or your conduct that's good or lack of it. So therefore, admit it, own it, take your lumps, get a broom and clean up your mess. Those of you who know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous, or you know people who have gone to AA meetings, you'll notice that one of the treatments of AA is that when you finally admit you're an alcoholic and you finally admit that you got to stay clean and you finally decide you want to do something that could be called responsible, then you may know at the end or towards the end of the treatment of Alcoholics Anonymous is you got to go clean up your mess. You got to go to people, apologize for your conduct, and clean it up. If you owe them money, you pay them back. Or you go get a broom and you clean it up, or something. When you change your contributions going forward, fascinating how people will give you all kinds of credit and they'll forgive you for what you did. If you think about the last few months and you think about all the protests and all the looting and all the burning and all the stealing and all the destroying everything, if you look at all that stuff that certain groups of people are doing, you may recall a few weeks ago a very impressive young black man was on television a lot. And what he did after all that looting and burning and wrecking and destroying and all that stuff that people felt entitled to do, which is clearly anything but responsible, this young black man, I just really admire this guy. What he did, he started at something like 3 o'clock in the morning. He brought out to his community that was trashed, and he brought out a whole bunch of things like brooms and rakes and garbage bags, and he spent something like 2 or 3 in the morning until 10 o'clock the following morning, something like that. And he did it on his own without saying anything to anybody. He just worked for hours on end in the middle of the night until the middle of the morning. And he cleaned up a whole big giant part of his community. And I thought, good for you. I mean, that's a wonderful initiative. And what happened? He got publicity. He got on television. Somebody bought him a car. And then some university or college close by gave him a free scholarship. Let me do that again. Here's a guy who behaved like a grown-up. Here's a young man who decided, no, this is just stupid. I want to do something that would be called adult, where I'd be proud of myself. My self-respect would go up if I clean up this mess, which is what he did on his own, without anybody telling him what to do. And this guy inspired, I'm confident, thousands and thousands of people who saw him on television. He was given a car, and he was also given a scholarship to college. Wow. I'm thinking, boy, do I admire that man. Boy, do I love that kind of role modeling. Boy, do I think that's wonderful. That's very adult and very responsible. So what I would like you to think about is when everyone increasingly takes more responsibility for their initiatives and their conduct, then everyone else will begin to step up and become grown-ups and role models themselves. The more you behave like a grown-up, the more you behave like a responsible adult, the more you become a role model for your own children or people in the community. What ends up happening is people join you because self-respect is contagious. Remember something else. When you think about trying to fix somebody else, when you think about blaming somebody else, remember something that's so obvious, this might really inspire you. You have a lot more power over your own behavior than the conduct of anybody else. You have a lot more power over your own behavior than the conduct of anybody else. Change your own conduct and contributions, and everyone else frequently has to change theirs. If you routinely get around somebody in your personal life and you tangle with each other on a regular basis, you're contributing to a bad outcome. Why? Because you're tangling. You're getting mad, and you're in a fight again. If you absolutely refuse to engage in a fight, then when somebody in your personal life wants to fight with you, it's pretty hard for them to fight because you refuse to fight. They have to be different when you change your own behavior. If you get ignited and engaged and now you start fighting with somebody, does your self-respect go up or down? Well, the answer is it goes down. On the other hand, if you refuse to engage in a fight, now your self-respect goes up. Much better responsible behavior. So finally, let me close to you by thinking about the following. I've encountered over my lifetime a variety of death with people. I watched my mom die. I watched my dad die. I miss them. I've encountered a bunch of people in my patient load whose parents have died, or people who I know who have died. I've certainly gone to plenty of funerals, and I've interviewed a bunch of people who are very sick. Here's what I've noticed that you may want to think about with respect to how are you contributing to the quality of your life, both in your network, your family, your kids, your community, and the world. How are you contributing or not? How are you behaving? How irresponsible are you versus how responsible are you? Here's what I've noticed about people who are close to death. Really fascinating. I was told this years ago, and I thought this is really, really good stuff. And then I noticed it countless times. What I noticed is that people who are close to dying, many of them are just terrified that somehow or another they're going to die and life will have been meaningless to them, or there was an absence of a legacy, or somehow or another people who are really afraid of dying feel like they haven't lived. Let me do that again. If people are sick and they know their life is limited, and you talk to them, you'll notice they have fear all over their faces. They're very, very anxious about the idea of dying because often it feels like they haven't lived. They've either completely avoided responsibility or they've just opted for beige. And it feels like life wasn't worth living. They waited for it to be over. People are very afraid if they routinely avoid responsibility for their lives. What's interesting also is people who are sick or they're dying, and they're absolutely okay with dying. They're okay with dying because they have lived. They take inventory of, I lived my life and it's been good. I produced good children. I contributed to society. A lot of people were impacted by my behavior or my initiative or whatever it is that I did. And my life was touched profoundly. What's interesting is the people who are okay with dying invariably feel like they lived their lives. And the ones that I know that were okay with dying felt like they lived their lives because they routinely took responsibility for themselves. They took responsibility for the outcomes. Rather than blaming everybody else, they looked in the mirror and took initiative. And that was their default. So, final thoughts for you today. Well, which do you really want? You want to waste your life by either avoiding responsibility for your behavior while you blame everybody else? That's pretty popular with certain groups. Or do you want to assume responsibility for yourself and your choices? Capitalize on your strengths. When you're doing something well, you do a lot of it. You recover quickly from your setbacks. When you get a failure, and everybody does, then you figure out, how am I going to get back in the saddle rather than woe is me? Then you contribute to society. Many years ago, I ran into a gentleman who really inspired me. He kept talking to me about contributing to society and why that's so important. Then later, I ran into another gentleman that said some form of the same thing. He was a client of mine. Both of these guys, one was my mentor. He died at age 100, and the other was a client of mine. He died at something like 92. And both of them felt okay with their lives because they were always contributing to society, something bigger than themselves, something to create more meaning. And then if you do that kind of stuff, life is worth living. It's entirely up to you. And if you want to complain and say, yeah, but, let me tell you what's wrong or what's wrong with them, then you missed the whole point. The point is, what are you going to do differently? What are you going to do that's somehow or another going to make a difference? A lot of people say that. I'd like to make a difference. I'm so pleased that I get to work with people that very often want to do that, and they want me to help them learn how to do it. How do I contribute and make a difference? Translated, they want whatever they did during their lifetime to contribute to the betterment of society. So my thoughts are, at the end of the day, remember, fair, reasonable, or otherwise, you're responsible for your life, for your conduct, for your initiative, for the way you conduct yourself. You're responsible for your contribution to relationships. You're responsible for your contribution to society. So rather than expecting somebody's supposed to take care of you, or somebody is supposed to fix it for you because you're unwilling to fix it for yourself, what you may want to do is remember two things about what I've discovered as a clinician after all these years of working with people, and this is really what life is about. Some of you have heard me before, have heard me say this. Life, essentially, comes down to two things. Two. And all the rest is noise. Life comes down to two things. If you want to make life worthy, if you want to somehow or another feel deserving of life turning out pretty good, then you decide to take responsibility for yourself, then this is what happens. When you do that, this is what happens. When life is really good, you're touching people's lives. Life is about two things. One, touching people's lives, and two, getting your life touched. Let me do it again. Life is about two things. Touching people's lives, you touching people's lives. And two, getting your life touched. And it's more than coincidental, ladies and gentlemen, that when you go touch people's lives, isn't it sort of curious how you get your life touched? I'm so tickled and pleased and feeling so blessed that I get to be in a profession that is in the business of touching people's lives by equipping them to be by far more effective, personally or professionally, in whatever life they're leading. And one of the biggest contributions to increasing the outcome of how frequently you are touching other people's lives is to take responsibility for yourself. Regardless of whether it's your job or anybody else's job, you do it. And the more you take responsibility for your own initiative, the more you're going to touch people's lives. When you do touch people's lives, then your life gets touched. Then everybody gets fed. It's like that really impressive young black man who decided to clean up his neighborhood right after the latest burning and looting and destruction of buildings and businesses. He decided, I'm going to clean up my neighborhood. That really got on television, really inspired me and a bunch of other people. I really admire that young man. And look at what happened to him. He touched a whole bunch of people's lives in a really profound manner. That is what makes life worth living. So I encourage you to finally remember the following. First off, I want you to know how much I really appreciate your willingness to listen to this material, and I hope it got your attention. I hope you subscribe if you like this material. The next one coming up is axiom number 5, and that'll be next week, probably on Friday. And so if you go to YouTube and you see all this stuff on Dr. J. Mitchell Perry, then you'll notice that you can see axioms number 1 through 4. And then the more you look at this stuff, you can repeat this stuff or hand it to other people because it very well may touch their lives, perhaps, if you got your life touched today. I wish you very well. I wish you a wonderful weekend. Make sure you hug people you care about. Tell them how much you care about them. Make sure that you take responsibility for yourself, which means, of course, wear that mask routinely, even if it's irritating. Social distancing routinely. Contribute to helping people when they need some help. Show a little initiative and care and regard and compassion, and take responsibility to help them learn how to do some form of the same thing. At which point then, coincidentally, as you touch their lives, your life gets touched as well. I'm Dr. Mitchell Perry. It's been certainly a pleasure. I look forward to our next recording in a week on YouTube and on Facebook. And feel free to give me your comments or give me a question. Go to jmperry.com, jmperry.com. Send me your emails. I will respond. It's been a pleasure. See you next time. Bye-bye.